She stood in the snow facing down a drunk on horseback, trembling with cold and fury. Behind her, 20 ranch hands and the man who had just paid $300 to protect her. In front of her, the ghost of a past she thought she had escaped. "You owe me nothing, Chester," she said, her voice cutting through the winter air like steel. But 13 years later he would come back, and this time money would not be enough. This is the story of how a desperate widow came to cook for a Kansas ranch in 1878, and ended up running everything, including the heart of the man who gave her a second chance. The wagon rattled into Lennon, Kansas on a blistering August afternoon in 1878, carrying a woman who looked like she had been through hell and back. Dust hung in the air like a curtain thick enough to taste clinging to everything it touched. The horses that pulled the wagon were exhausted, their heads hanging low, foam streaking their necks. But it was the woman who commanded attention. Yates Owens watched from his ranch office window as the dust settled around her determined figure. He had been going over the ledgers for the third time that week, trying to make sense of numbers that refused to add up the way he wanted. The ranch was profitable, but barely. Every dollar mattered. Every decision could mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving. He set down his pen and stood moving to get a better view. She climbed down from that wagon with more grace than any woman had a right to possess after 3 days on rough roads. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, not a strand out of place despite the journey. Her traveling dress was covered in the kind of dust that told stories of desperation and long miles, but she wore it like armor. There was something in the way she held herself, pride maybe, or stubbornness, possibly both. Yates set down his ledger and walked out onto the porch of the main house, his boots echoing on the weathered wood. The sound carried across the yard, cutting through the afternoon heat. The woman was already talking to his foreman, Miguel Rodriguez, gesturing toward the collection of buildings that made up the sprawling ranch operation. Miguel was nodding his weathered face, giving nothing away the way it always did when he was sizing someone up. Miguel pointed toward Yates, and the woman turned to look at him with eyes the color of strong coffee, eyes that held intelligence and something else, something that made his chest tighten in a way he had not felt in years. Not since Sarah. Not since the fever took her and left him alone in this big house with nothing but work and memories that hurt too much to examine closely. The woman started walking toward him, and Yates descended the steps slowly, taking his time to assess this unexpected arrival. He had indeed placed an advertisement in several newspapers across Kansas and Missouri. He was desperate to find someone who could feed his 20 ranch hands something better than the charred meat and watery beans they had been suffering through since old Cookie had died last spring. The men were starting to complain. Some were talking about moving on to other ranches where the food was better. He could not afford to lose good hands over something as simple as meals. But he had not expected anyone like this. Most women who came west alone were either running from something or running toward something equally desperate. He knew the look. He had seen it before in the eyes of homesteaders who had lost everything to drought or debt, in the faces of widows with nowhere else to go. This woman had that look, but there was steel underneath it. She was not broken. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "Mr. Owens." She called out, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising strength. "I am Penelope Bartlett. I understand you need a cook." Her voice did not waver, did not plead. She stated facts, nothing more. Yates stopped a respectful distance from her, close enough to talk without shouting, far enough to maintain propriety. Up close, he could see the weariness etched into her face, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard roads. But he could also see the set of her jaw, the straightness of her spine. She was waiting for his answer, and she would not beg for it. "I did place an advertisement," Yates acknowledged, keeping his voice neutral. "But I expected responses through the mail, not someone showing up unannounced." Penelope Bartlett lifted her chin, and he saw the pride there. The kind of pride that came from having nothing left to lose, but refusing to surrender anyway. The kind of pride that could be either a strength or a fatal flaw, depending on the circumstances. "I do not have time for letters and negotiations, Mr. Owens. I need employment immediately, and you need a cook. I can prepare meals for large groups. I can work with limited supplies, and I can start today if you will have me." There was something in her voice, a tremor beneath the steel, that told Yates she was not exaggerating about the immediacy of her need. He glanced at Miguel, who had followed her over and was standing a few paces back. Miguel shrugged in that way that meant the decision was entirely up to the boss. The afternoon sun beat down on all of them, and Yates could see the weariness in Penelope Bartlett's posture, the way she held herself rigid as if she might collapse if she allowed herself to relax even for a moment. "Where are you coming from?" Yates asked. It was a reasonable question. He needed to know something about her, about what had brought her to his door in such obvious need. "St. Louis," she replied without hesitation. "My husband died 6 months ago. The debts he left behind took everything. I have no family, no prospects, and considerable skill in a kitchen. I saw your advertisement in the Kansas City newspaper 2 weeks ago and have been traveling since." The bluntness of her statement impressed him. No tears, no elaborate sob story, just facts delivered with the kind of practical resignation that Yates understood in his bones. Life in Kansas Territory was hard, and it got harder every year. People who survived out here were the ones who could look reality in the face and keep moving forward anyway. The ones who could take a blow and get back up. The ones who understood that nobody was coming to save them, so they had better save themselves. "The pay is $30 a month," Yates said, making his decision. "Room and board included. You will have a cabin to yourself, small but private. You will be responsible for 3 meals a day for the hands, plus whatever I need at the main house. The men work hard, and they eat accordingly." "Can you handle that?" "I can handle that and more," Penelope said. There was no boast in her tone, just simple confidence. The kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and not feeling the need to exaggerate or apologize for it. Then, "Welcome to the ranch." Miss Bartlett Yates said deliberately, using the title that restored her unmarried status in his mind, though he knew it was improper. "Miguel will show you to your cabin and the cookhouse. We eat at 6 noon and 6. I expect you will need some time to familiarize yourself with the supplies and equipment." "I will have supper ready at 6, Penelope said firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Owens." She turned to follow Miguel before Yates could respond, and he watched her walk away with that same determined grace, her spine straight despite what had to be bone-deep exhaustion. She did not look back, did not check to see if he was still watching. She had gotten what she came for, and now she was moving forward to the next task. Something stirred in his chest again, something he had thought dead and buried along with Sarah 5 years ago. He recognized it dimly, like seeing a familiar face after a long absence. Interest, curiosity, maybe even the faint stirrings of attraction, though he pushed that thought away as soon as it surfaced. She was an employee, nothing more. He needed a cook, and she needed employment. It was a business arrangement, and he would be a fool to let it become anything else. Yates shook his head and returned to his office, but he found he could not concentrate on the ledgers anymore. The numbers blurred together as his mind kept returning to the image of Penelope Bartlett climbing down from that wagon, all fierce determination and barely concealed desperation. He knew that combination well. It was written into the very soil of Kansas, into every homestead and ranch that struggled against drought and low cattle prices and harsh winters and the simple grinding reality of trying to build something lasting in a place that seemed determined to break anyone foolish enough to try. He had built this ranch from nothing over the past 7 years, started with a piece of land and a dream and a stubbornness that refused to quit even when common sense said he should. He had survived Sarah's death, survived the loneliness that followed, survived by pouring everything into the work. The ranch had become his life, his purpose, the thing that got him out of bed every morning. And it was not enough. He knew that even if he did not want to admit it. At 6 o'clock precisely, Yates walked into the cookhouse and stopped dead in his tracks. The transformation was immediate and complete. The long tables were set with actual plates instead of the battered tin the men had been using for months. The smell that filled the air made his mouth water instantly. Real cooking, the kind that made you remember what it felt like to sit at a proper table and eat a proper meal instead of just shoveling fuel into your body to keep working. Penelope stood at the massive stove, her dress now protected by a practical apron, her hair still pulled back, but with small curls escaping around her face from the heat. She was ladling stew into a serving pot, and beside it sat fresh biscuits, golden and perfect steam rising from their split tops. The sight of those biscuits alone was enough to make a grown man weep. The ranch hands filed in behind Yates, their usual rowdy conversation dying away as they too caught the scent of real cooking. Miguel let out a low whistle of appreciation, and young Tommy Fredericks, barely 19 and still growing into his lanky frame, looked like he might cry from sheer joy. "Gentlemen," Penelope said, turning to face them with a large spoon in her hand, "supper is ready. I expect you to wash your hands before you eat at my tables, and I expect you to behave like civilized human beings. Anyone who wants seconds is welcome to them, but there will be no waste. Am I understood?" There was a moment of stunned silence. The men were not used to being given orders by a woman, especially not a woman they had just met. But there was something in Penelope's tone, in the way she stood there, with that spoon like a weapon, that made it clear this was not up for debate. These were her tables now, her cookhouse, and they would follow her rules or they would not eat. "Yes, ma'am," Miguel said, and headed immediately to the wash basin. The other hands followed suit, and Yates found himself impressed all over again. She had taken command of the cookhouse in less than 6 hours, establishing rules and expectations with the kind of natural authority that could not be taught. You either had it or you did not, and Penelope Bartlett clearly had it. Yates washed his hands and took his usual seat at the head of the table, watching as Penelope served the men with efficient grace. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, the kind of hearty fare that men who worked from dawn to dusk needed. The biscuits were light and buttery, flaking apart at the slightest touch, and there was even a pot of coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the bitter mud they had been choking down for months. The hands ate with the kind of focused intensity that spoke better than any words about the quality of the meal. There was no conversation, just the sounds of eating and the occasional grunt of satisfaction. Yates ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching Penelope as she moved around the cookhouse. She had a system already he could see. Everything in its place, everything done with maximum efficiency. She was not just a good cook. She was organized, methodical, someone who thought ahead and planned accordingly. Miss Bartlett, Yates said when the eating had slowed enough for conversation. "This is exceptional." "Thank you, Mr. Owens," Penelope replied, refilling his coffee cup without being asked. "I found your pantry adequately stocked, though I will need to make a list of items for your next trip to town." Whatever you need, Yates said and meant it. If she could produce meals like this consistently, he would buy her anything she required. The cost would be worth it. Happy hands worked harder, stayed longer, caused fewer problems. It was simple economics, and Penelope Bartlett was already proving to be worth every penny of her $30 a month. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt almost miraculous after months of barely edible food. Penelope proved to be as good as her word, producing hearty breakfasts, before dawn substantial midday meals and suppers that had the hands looking forward to the end of their workday with new enthusiasm. The grumbling stopped. The talk of moving on to other ranches disappeared. Men who had been sullen and difficult became cheerful and cooperative, all because they were finally eating decent food. But Yates began to notice that she was doing more than just cooking. On the third day, he found her in the chicken coop, reorganizing the laying boxes and muttering to herself about efficiency. The chickens seemed just as confused as he felt, clucking and fluttering as she moved things around with quick, decisive movements. On the fifth day, she was examining the vegetable garden that had been left to grow wild, making notes on a piece of paper. The garden had been Sarah's project back when Sarah was alive. After she died, Yates could not bring himself to tend it, and the hands had no interest in growing vegetables when there was cattle work to be done. It had gone to seed, become a tangle of weeds and forgotten plants. On the seventh day, she appeared at his office door with a list that made his eyebrows rise. "What is this?" he asked, scanning the detailed itemization of supplies, tools, and materials. "It is what you need to run this ranch properly," Penelope said, her tone brooking no argument. Your cookhouse equipment is outdated and inefficient. Your chicken coops are poorly maintained. Your vegetable garden could feed twice as many men if it were properly cultivated. And your supply ordering system is chaotic at best." Yates leaned back in his chair, studying her. She stood in his doorway like she owned the place, chin up, shoulders back, meeting his gaze without flinching. Most people were intimidated by him. He was a big man, and he had a reputation for being hard but fair. But Penelope Bartlett did not seem intimidated in the slightest. "And you think you can fix all of this?" he asked. "I know I can," Penelope said, "but I need your authorization to make changes." There was a challenge in her eyes, a test to see if he was the kind of man who could handle a woman with opinions and initiative, or if he was the kind who would be threatened by competence. Yates had built this ranch from nothing, over the past 7 years had fought drought and debt and every imaginable setback. He recognized a valuable asset when he saw one. And Penelope Bartlett was clearly an asset, even if she was also starting to be something of a puzzle. "Do what needs doing," he said simply. "If you need money, come to me. If you need the hands to help with heavy work, tell Miguel. But understand that if you take this on, I will hold you accountable for the results." Penelope smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. The severe expression she usually wore softened, and for just a moment Yates caught a glimpse of who she might have been before life knocked her down, before her husband died and left her with nothing but debts and desperation. "I would expect nothing less." "Mr. Owens," she said. She was gone before he could respond, and Yates sat alone in his office, wondering what exactly he had just set in motion. He had hired her to cook, and she was doing that admirably. But she was also taking over aspects of the ranch operation that he had been neglecting, pointing out inefficiencies he had not even noticed, suggesting improvements that actually made sense. It should have bothered him, should have felt like an overstep, like she was exceeding her authority. Instead, it felt like relief. The answer became clear over the following weeks as Penelope Bartlett systematically took over the organizational aspects of ranch life that Yates had been too busy or too indifferent to manage properly. She reorganized the pantry with ruthless efficiency, creating a system that made it easy to see what supplies were running low. No more discovering at the last minute that they were out of flour or sugar or coffee. Everything was labeled. Everything was in its place. Everything was tracked. She took over the ordering, dealing directly with the merchants in linen, and negotiating prices with a shrewdness that saved the ranch money. Yates heard about it from the general store owner who complained that the new cook was driving too hard a bargain. Yates just smiled and told him that was his problem, not the ranch's. She revitalized the vegetable garden, enlisting young Tommy to help with the heavy digging in exchange for extra desserts. The boy was happy to do it. He was at that age where he was always hungry, and Penelope's pies and cakes were worth any amount of labor. Soon fresh greens and herbs were appearing on the table, adding variety and nutrition to meals that had been monotonously meat-heavy for too long. She even tackled the ranch's chaotic record-keeping, pointing out to Yates that he was losing track of expenses and income in ways that could become serious problems. He kept his records in a haphazard fashion, scribbling notes on scraps of paper, trying to remember transactions weeks after they happened. It worked well enough when the ranch was small, but as it grew, the system was starting to fail. "You are a rancher, not an accountant," she said one evening when she appeared at his office with yet another list of suggestions. "But you need someone who can manage the business side of things properly." "And that someone is you?" Yates asked. But there was no challenge in his voice, only curiosity. He was genuinely interested in her answer. She had been on the ranch for less than a month, and she had already made herself indispensable in ways that went far beyond cooking. "My husband was a merchant," Penelope said, her voice carefully neutral. "I handled his books for 8 years. I know how to track income and expenses, how to project seasonal variations, how to identify problems before they become catastrophic. Let me help you, Mr. Owens." Yates looked at the ledgers spread across his desk, the evidence of his own inadequacy in this area, and made a decision that felt both risky and absolutely right. "Show me what you can do," he said. That night began a partnership that transformed not just the ranch's operations, but something deeper, something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Penelope spent evenings in Yates's office going through years of poorly maintained records, creating systems and projections that revealed the ranch's actual financial position. It was better than Yates had feared, but worse than he had hoped, and her frank assessment of the situation felt like a relief after years of muddling through on instinct and hope. They worked side by side, their conversations moving gradually from purely business matters to more personal topics. At first it was just small things, comments about the weather, observations about the hands, stories about town gossip that Miguel brought back from his trips to Linen. But slowly, carefully, they began to share more. Yates found himself telling her about Sarah one night when the lamp was burning low and the numbers were starting to blur together, about the fever that had taken her so suddenly, about the guilt he still carried for not being able to save her. Penelope listened without offering empty platitudes, without trying to fix something that could not be fixed. She just listened, and somehow that was exactly what he needed. When she shared her own story, he understood why she had listened the way she did. "Robert was not a good man," she said quietly, one evening, her pen still moving across the ledger page, as if the admission was easier if she did not have to look at him while she made it. "I married him because I was young and foolish and thought I had no other options. He was charming at first, but the charm hid debts and gambling and a dozen other vices. When he died, I thought I would finally be free. But instead I discovered that his debts were now mine. Everything we owned was seized. I had nothing left but my skills and my determination not to let his mistakes destroy me." "You could have remarried," Yates said carefully. "A woman with your abilities would have had options." Penelope looked up at him, her brown eyes fierce in the lamplight. "I will never put myself under another man's control like that again. Whatever I build now, I build for myself." The words should have been off-putting, should have made Yates defensive, made him think she was one of those women who hated men, who blamed all men for the sins of one. But instead, he found them admirable. There was a strength in Penelope Bartlett that matched the strength required to survive in Kansas, a refusal to surrender to circumstances that he recognized in his own bones. "I respect that," he said simply, and the look she gave him held surprise and something that might have been the first stirrings of trust. The summer faded into autumn, and the ranch settled into its new rhythms under Penelope's efficient management. The leaves on the few cottonwood trees near the creek turned gold, then brown, drifting down to carpet the ground. The air took on that particular crispness that Kansas autumn brought, promising cold to come, but still holding the warmth of summer in the afternoons. The hands had stopped thinking of her as just the cook and started deferring to her on matters of supply scheduling and organization. When someone needed to know if there was enough feed for the winter, they asked Penelope. When a piece of equipment broke and needed replacing, they checked with Penelope first to see if it was in the budget. Miguel joked that she was running the place, but there was truth beneath the humor, and Yates found he did not mind. The transformation was remarkable. In just 3 months, Penelope had taken a ranch that operated on chaos and instinct and turned it into something that ran like a well-oiled machine. Expenses were down because she caught waste before it happened. Income was up because she had identified markets for products they had been practically giving away. The books were organized in a way that made sense, that let Yates see at a glance where the ranch stood financially. But it was more than just her competence that drew Yates. It was the way she laughed at Tommy's terrible jokes, genuine amusement lighting up her face even when the punchline was groan-worthy. It was the way she fussed over Miguel's arthritis during cold mornings, making him a special tea that she swore would help with the pain. It was the way she had gradually transformed the cookhouse into a place that felt like home rather than just a feeding station. She had hung curtains in the windows, simple gingham that she had sewn herself. She had placed wildflowers in jars on the tables, small touches that made the space welcoming. It was the quiet evenings in his office when they worked together in comfortable silence, the occasional brush of her hand against his, when they reached for the same paper, the growing awareness that he looked forward to seeing her in ways that had nothing to do with ranch business. He would catch himself watching for her in the mornings, listening for her voice, finding excuses to walk past the cookhouse 3 times a day when once would have sufficed. Yates had not thought about courting anyone since Sarah's death. The idea had seemed disloyal at first and then simply impossible. What woman would want to tie herself to a struggling rancher in the middle of Kansas? What woman would want to take on the hardship and isolation and endless work that came with ranch life? But Penelope was already here, already integral to his life in ways that made his chest tighten when he thought about her leaving. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that promised harder weather to come. The flakes fell softly at first, then with increasing intensity, covering the prairie in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. Yates was in the barn checking on the horses when he heard raised voices from the direction of the main yard. The sound cut through the muffled quiet of the snowfall, sharp and aggressive. He hurried out to find Penelope facing down a man on horseback. Her small frame somehow managed to look formidable despite the obvious size difference. The man was swaying in his saddle, and even from a distance Yates could smell the whiskey on him. This was trouble, the kind of trouble that could turn ugly fast. "I told you to leave," Penelope was saying, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You have no business here." The snow was falling harder now, settling on her hair, on her shoulders. She had come out without a coat, and Yates could see her trembling, but whether from cold or fury, he could not tell. "I have business with you," the man said, and Yates recognized the slurred speech of someone who had been drinking heavily. "You think you can just run off and leave your obligations? You owe me money, Penelope. Robert owed me money, and that debt passed to you." "I owe you nothing," Chester, Penelope snapped. "Robert's gambling debts died with him, and you know it." So this was Chester Williams. The name had come up in their late-night conversations, always with a note of bitterness in Penelope's voice. One of Robert's gambling friends, one of the men who had encouraged her husband's worst habits. One of the creditors who had hounded her after Robert's death, trying to squeeze money out of a woman who had nothing left to give. "Maybe legally," Chester said, "but morally, you think you can just start over, like none of it happened. I want what I am owed." Yates strode forward, positioning himself between Penelope and the mounted man. The snow crunched under his boots. Miguel and several other hands had appeared at the sound of the argument, forming a loose semicircle behind Yates. The message was clear. Chester was outnumbered, and if this turned physical, it would not go well for him. "I think the lady has made herself clear," Yates said, keeping his voice level and cold. "You need to leave." Chester focused on Yates with difficulty, his red-rimmed eyes struggling to make sense of this new element. His face was flushed with drink and anger, his clothes rumpled and stained. He looked like a man who had been riding hard and drinking harder, a man who had nothing left to lose. "Who the hell are you?" Chester demanded. "I am Yates Owens, and this is my ranch. Miss Bartlett is under my protection. Whatever disputes you think you have with her, you can take them up with a lawyer or the sheriff, but you are not going to settle them here. Now get moving before I have my men remove you." The threat was real, and Chester was drunk, but not so drunk that he could not calculate his odds. He looked around at Miguel and the other hands at their hard faces and crossed arms, and apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. "This is not over," he muttered. But he turned his horse and rode off toward Lennon, weaving slightly in the saddle. Yates turned to Penelope, who was shaking with reaction, her arms wrapped around herself. The snow had accumulated on her dress, white against the dark fabric. Her face was pale, her eyes too bright. She looked like she might shatter if touched. "Are you all right?" Yates asked. "Yes," she said, but her voice was unsteady. "I apologize. I did not think anyone from my old life would follow me here." "Come inside," Yates said gently. "We should talk about this." They went into his office, and Yates poured her a small glass of whiskey despite her protests. The fire was burning low in the fireplace, and he added another log before turning back to her. "Drink," he ordered. "You have had a shock." Penelope obeyed, coughing slightly at the burn, but color returned to her cheeks. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the whiskey glass cradled in both hands, staring into the amber liquid as if it held answers. Chester Williams was Robert's closest friend and worst influence, she said finally. They gambled together, drank together, and lost money together. When Robert died, Chester tried to claim I owed him for various supposed loans and debts. I proved to the courts in St. Louis that I had no legal obligation, but Chester has never accepted it. I had hoped that coming all the way to Kansas would be far enough to escape him. How much does he claim you owe? Yates asked. $300, Penelope said bitterly. Money I do not have for debts I never incurred. But Chester is not rational about it. He blames me for Robert's death somehow, as if I caused the heart attack that killed him. Yates thought about the amount. $300 was substantial, but not impossible. He thought about Penelope's pride, her fierce independence, and the careful way she was not asking him for help, even though the request hung unspoken in the air. He thought about how much she had already done for the ranch, how much more valuable she was than any amount of money. And he thought about how it felt to see her threatened, to see fear in her eyes, and how much he wanted to make that fear go away. I will handle Chester Williams, Yates said finally. No, Penelope said immediately. This is my problem, not yours. You work for me, which makes it my problem when someone shows up drunk and making threats. Let me handle this my way. Their eyes met across the desk, and something passed between them. Something that went beyond employer and employee, beyond simple friendship. It was understanding recognition, the acknowledgement of a connection that had been building for months through shared work and late-night conversations, and 100 small moments of kindness and respect. Penelope nodded slowly, accepting his protection, even as he could see it cost her pride to do so. She had built her life on not needing anyone, on being self-sufficient and independent. Accepting help meant admitting she could not handle everything alone. But she was practical enough to know when to stand aside and let someone else fight her battles. The next morning, Yates rode into Lennon and found Chester Williams nursing a hangover in the town's single saloon. The place was nearly empty at this early hour, just a few regulars who lived more in the saloon than out of it. The air was thick with stale smoke and old beer, and the floor was sticky under Yates's boots. Chester was hunched over a table in the corner, a glass of whiskey in front of him, his head in his hands. Yates sat down across from him without invitation and laid $300 on the table between them. The bills were crisp and new, drawn from the ranch account that morning. It hurt to withdraw that much money. It would set back his plans for spring expansion, force him to delay some improvements he had been planning. But it was worth it. This is for whatever debt you think Penelope Bartlett owes you, Yates said coldly. Take it and understand that if I see you on my property again, if I hear that you have bothered Miss Bartlett in any way, I will not be as generous. Am I clear? Chester stared at the money, greed and anger warring on his florid face. His hands shook as he reached for the bills, and Yates could see the broken capillaries in his nose, the yellowed whites of his eyes. This was a man destroying himself with drink and bitterness, a man who blamed everyone else for his own failures. "Who are you to buy her debts?" Chester asked, but his hands were already counting the bills, checking to make sure they were all there. "I am someone who pays his obligations," Yates said, "which is more than can be said for her late husband, or apparently for you. Take the money and leave Kansas. There is nothing for you here." Chester grabbed the bills, counted them twice, and stuffed them into his pocket. His fingers fumbled with the task, clumsy from drink and greed. "She always did land on her feet," he muttered, but he was already standing, already calculating how long $300 would last him elsewhere, how many bottles of whiskey it would buy, how many card games it would stake him to. Chester Williams was gone. For now. But Yates had a feeling deep in his gut that this wouldn't be the last time they'd see that particular ghost from Penelope's past. The money would hurt the ranch's finances, would set back some of his plans, but it was worth it to know that Penelope was safe from this particular ghost of her past. Worth it to see her smile when he told her it was handled. Worth it because he was starting to realize that her happiness mattered to him more than it probably should. When he returned to the ranch that evening, Penelope was waiting for him in his office. She was standing by the window looking out at the prairie that stretched away to the horizon. The setting sun painted everything gold and red, and for a moment Yates just stood in the doorway and looked at her backlit by that dying light, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with strength and character. "You paid him," she said without turning around. It was not a question. "I did," Yates confirmed. "I told you not to." "I know." Penelope turned to face him and her eyes were blazing. She was angry, and Yates found himself thinking that even her anger was magnificent. There was nothing petty or mean about it. It was the righteous fury of someone whose independence had been compromised, whose ability to fight her own battles had been questioned. "You had no right," she said, her voice rising. "That was my debt, my problem, my responsibility." "It was a debt you did not owe," Yates said calmly. "And I had every right to protect someone under my care." "I am not a charity case, Mr. Owens," Penelope said. Her hands clenched at her sides. "I came here to build something of my own, not to trade one form of dependence for another." "I know that," Yates said, and suddenly he was tired of the careful distance they had been maintaining, tired of pretending that what he felt was simple employer concern. He crossed the room to stand in front of her close enough to see the pulse beating in her throat, to smell the faint scent of flour and cinnamon that always clung to her. "I did not pay that money because I think you are weak or incapable. I paid it because Chester Williams is dangerous and unpredictable, and I could not stand the thought of him threatening you." He paused, knowing that what he said next would change everything between them for better or worse. But he had never been a coward, and he would not start now. "I paid it because you matter to me, Penelope. More than you should, more than is probably wise, but there it is." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Penelope stared at him with wide eyes, her anger forgotten in surprise. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. They stood frozen for a long moment, the office silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of the hands coming in from the day's work. "Yates," she finally said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, the first time she had dropped the careful formality that had governed their interactions. His name sounded different in her voice, intimate and familiar. "I am not asking you for anything." Yates continued, the words tumbling out now that he had started. "I know you value your independence. I know you have no interest in giving up control of your life to any man, but I needed you to know that my interest in your welfare goes beyond what you contribute to this ranch. You have become important to me in ways that have nothing to do with your cooking or your organizational skills or any of the practical reasons I should value your presence here." Penelope closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I cannot be what you need. I cannot be the kind of wife Sarah was, sweet and domestic and content to let you make all the decisions. I am too damaged, too determined to control my own fate, too much of everything that a man like you should not want." "You are everything I want," Yates said, taking a careful step closer. "Not despite who you are, but because of it. I do not need another Sarah. I need someone who challenges me, who sees problems and fixes them, who has the strength to survive anything life throws at us. I need a partner, Penelope, not a decoration. And you are the finest partner I could imagine." A tear spilled down her cheek and she brushed it away impatiently, as if angry at herself for showing weakness. But Yates saw it for what it was. Not weakness at all, but the breaking of a dam that had been holding back too much for too long. "You make it sound so simple," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is not simple," Yates admitted, "but it is real. What I feel for you is real, and I think what you feel for me is real too, even if you are afraid to admit it." Penelope let out a shaky laugh that was half sob. "I am afraid. I am terrified. The last time I trusted a man with my heart, it destroyed my life." "I am not," Robert Yates said gently. "And you are not the same woman you were when you married him. We are both different people now, shaped by loss and survival. Maybe that means we have a chance to build something real." He held out his hand, palm up, an offering rather than a demand. Penelope looked at it for a long moment, and Yates could see the war being fought behind her eyes. Fear against hope, past pain against present possibility. He waited, hardly breathing, giving her all the time she needed to make her choice. Then slowly, so slowly, it seemed to take forever, she reached out and placed her hand in his. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through Yates that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with recognition. This was right. This woman, this moment, this choice. He drew her closer, giving her every chance to pull away, to change her mind, to retreat back behind her walls. When she did not, when she instead stepped into his arms, he wrapped them around her and held her as if she were something precious and fragile, even though he knew she was neither. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding each other in the lamplight, while the first real snow of the season began to fall outside. Yates could feel her heart beating against his chest, could feel the tension slowly draining out of her as she allowed herself, perhaps for the first time in years, to lean on someone else, to trust someone else, to believe that maybe, just maybe, not all men were like Robert, not all love ended in betrayal and loss. When they finally pulled apart, Penelope looked up at him with eyes that held fear and hope in equal measure. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling, a small, tentative smile that transformed her features. "I do not know how to do this," she said. "I do not know how to trust this." "Then we will figure it out together," Yates said, and kissed her forehead gently. No rush, no pressure, just us, taking it one day at a time. She nodded against his chest, and Yates felt something settle into place inside him, something that had been broken and lost since Sarah died. Not a replacement, because Sarah could never be replaced, but something new, something different, something that belonged entirely to this moment and this woman and this unexpected second chance at happiness. The winter that followed was hard, as Kansas winters always were. The snow came in waves, blanketing the prairie in white that stretched to the horizon, broken only by the dark shapes of cattle huddled together for warmth. The wind howled across the open land, finding every crack and gap in the buildings, making the nights bitter cold. But inside the main house in the office where Yates and Penelope spent their evenings working side by side, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire blazing in the hearth. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully, with the kind of deliberate attention that came from two people who had both been hurt before and were determined not to make the same mistakes twice. They continued to work together after supper, going over the books and planning for spring, but now their hands found excuses to touch. A brush of fingers when passing papers, a hand on a shoulder when pointing out something in the ledger. Small moments of contact that sent warmth spreading through both of them. Their conversations wandered into more personal territory. Yates told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father who had been a farmer and his mother who had died when he was 12, about coming to Kansas with dreams of building something that would last, something he could be proud of, about meeting Sarah at a church social and knowing within 5 minutes that he wanted to marry her. Penelope told him about her childhood in Illinois, about parents she barely remembered who had died of cholera when she was 8. About the aunt who had raised her with more duty than affection, about meeting Robert when she was 17 and thinking he was her escape from a life of servitude and loneliness, about slowly realizing that she had simply traded one form of captivity for another. Sometimes they simply sat together in comfortable silence, content just to be near each other. Yates would work on breeding records for the horses while Penelope organized supply orders, and the only sounds would be the scratch of pen on paper and the crackle of the fire. Those were the moments Yates treasured most, the companionable quiet that spoke of deep comfort and trust. The ranch hands watched this development with approval and amusement in equal measure. Miguel took to grinning knowingly whenever he saw them together, which was often because Penelope had taken to walking out to check on various projects at times when she knew Yates would be there. Tommy went so far as to pick wildflowers one early spring day when the first shoots were pushing through the melting snow, leaving them on Penelope's cabin doorstep with a note that read, "For the boss lady from the crew." Penelope had laughed until she cried when she found them, then arranged the wildflowers in a jar on her table where everyone could see them. The gesture touched her deeply. Yates could tell. She had spent so long being alone, being responsible only for herself, that being part of something larger, Being cared for by this rough collection of cowboys and drifters meant more than she could easily express. By the time the first green shoots of spring appeared pushing through the mud left by melting snow, Penelope had fully taken over the management of the ranch's business operations. She handled everything with a competence that freed Yates to focus on the actual ranching on the cattle and horses and land that he loved. She managed the books with meticulous care, tracking every penny that came in and went out. She handled the supply ordering with an eye for both quality and economy. She maintained correspondence with buyers in Kansas City and Chicago, building relationships that would serve the ranch well in years to come. Under her management, the ranch's finances stabilized and then began to improve. Her careful tracking of expenses and income revealed opportunities for savings and growth that Yates had missed. She pointed out that they were selling their cattle at the wrong time of year, waiting too long, and missing the peak prices. She identified ways to reduce waste in feed and supplies. She negotiated better terms with merchants and creditors. But it was more than just business competence that made her invaluable. Penelope had become the heart of the ranch in ways that went beyond cooking and accounting. She was the one the hands came to with their problems, whether it was a toothache that needed tending or a letter from home that needed answering. She was the one who nursed them through illnesses, mixing remedies, and sitting up through the night when fever struck. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who made special meals to mark occasions, who somehow knew when someone was homesick or troubled and needed a kind word. She had transformed the ranch from a collection of men working together into something that felt like a family. And Yates watched this transformation with awe and growing love that he could no longer deny even to himself. On a warm May evening, when the prairie was coming alive with wildflowers and new grass, Yates saddled 2 horses and invited Penelope to ride out with him to see the new calves. She accepted with a smile that made his heart race, changing into a split riding skirt she had made for herself, practical and modest, but allowing her to ride astride rather than side saddle. They rode together through the greening prairie, the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the world on fire. The air smelled of grass and earth and growing things, that particular scent of spring that promised renewal and hope. Yates felt a contentment he had not experienced in years, maybe ever. This sense of completeness that came from sharing his life with someone who understood not just what he did, but why he did it. They stopped on a small rise overlooking the ranch. The buildings looked small and neat in the distance, the cattle dark shapes moving slowly across the grassland. The setting sun turned everything golden, and for a moment Yates just sat on his horse and looked at it, all this thing he had built, this life he had created from nothing but determination and hard work. And then he looked at Penelope and realized that none of it meant anything without her. She was watching the sunset, her face peaceful in a way he had never seen during those first desperate weeks. The weariness that had characterized her early months at the ranch was completely gone, replaced by a confidence and happiness that made her even more beautiful. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the ride, curling around her face in the warm breeze. Her cheeks were flushed from the exercise and the fresh air. She looked like she belonged here, like she had always belonged here. "I have something to ask you," Yates said, suddenly nervous in a way he had not been since he was a young man courting Sarah. Penelope turned to look at him, her eyes curious but calm. "Yes." Yates dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist longer than strictly necessary. She smiled up at him, and he felt his courage almost fail. This was a risk. She had made it clear that she valued her independence, that she had no interest in being under any man's control. What if she said no? What if asking drove her away? But greater than his fear was his certainty. His knowledge that this woman was meant to be his partner in every sense of the word, that what they had built together was too precious to leave unspoken, undefined. He dropped to one knee on the prairie grass, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, simple gold, with a single small diamond. It was the best he could afford after paying off Chester Williams, but he had chosen it with care, selecting a stone that caught the light and threw it back in tiny rainbows. Penelope's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in surprise. She had not expected this, he realized. For all her cleverness and insight, she had not seen this coming. Penelope Bartlett Yates began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "You came to my ranch to cook for the hands, and you ended up running everything. You organized my business, fixed my systems, cared for my men, and somewhere in the middle of all that, you captured my heart completely." He paused, watching her face. Tears were gathering in her eyes, but she was smiling, and that gave him courage to continue. "I love you. I love your strength, your intelligence, your refusal to settle for less than you deserve. I love the way you have made this ranch a home again. Will you marry me? Will you be my partner, not just in business, but in life?" Penelope's tears spilled over, running down her cheeks, but she was still smiling. She looked down at him, kneeling there in the grass. This strong, quiet man who had given her a chance when she had nothing, who had defended her against her past, who had somehow seen past her prickly independence to the woman underneath who was desperate to be loved, but terrified to trust. "You are sure," she asked, her voice trembling. "You are sure you want to marry someone like me, someone who will argue with you and challenge your decisions and never be content to just stay quietly in the background?" "I have never been more sure of anything," Yates said firmly. "I do not want a quiet, obedient wife. I want you exactly as you are." "Then yes," Penelope said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you, Yates Owens. I will be your partner and your wife, and probably a thorn in your side half the time, but I will love you with everything I have." Yates stood and kissed her properly for the first time. Not the chaste kiss on the forehead he had given her before, but a real kiss, deep and passionate and full of all the longing and hope and love that had been building between them for months. The prairie stretched out around them, vast and beautiful and full of promise. The setting sun painted them in gold, and in that moment, everything was perfect. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Penelope was wearing his ring. Yates felt like the wealthiest man in Kansas, despite the modest state of his bank account. She had said yes. This remarkable woman had agreed to be his wife, to build a life with him, to trust him with her future and her heart. They stood together on that hill as the sun sank below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, talking about the future with an excitement neither had felt in years. They would marry in June, Penelope decided. That would give her time to make a dress and prepare for the wedding. It would be simple, she insisted. Just the ranch hands and a few people from town, nothing fancy or elaborate. Yates agreed to everything. He would have agreed to anything in that moment. All he wanted was for her to be his wife, to make their partnership official in the eyes of God and man. Everything else was just details. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and barely contained excitement. Penelope worked on her dress in the evenings, sewing by lamplight after the day's work was done. It was simple cream-colored cotton, but she was making it with care, adding small touches of lace at the collar and cuffs. Tommy's mother in town helped with the more complicated parts, teaching Penelope stitches she had never learned. Miguel built new furniture for the main house, crafting a wardrobe and dresser for what would become their shared bedroom. The other hands pitched in to paint the bedroom, to repair the porch, to make the house worthy of a bride. There was an excitement on the ranch that had nothing to do with work, a sense of celebration that infected everyone. The women of Linen, who had been skeptical of Penelope at first, began to soften as word of the engagement spread. Mrs. Henderson, who had been so critical at the church, came to call one afternoon with a wedding gift, a set of embroidered dish towels that had belonged to her mother. It was a gesture of acceptance, an acknowledgement that Penelope was no longer an outsider, but one of them, a woman who would be married to one of their most respected ranchers. Penelope accepted the gift with grace, inviting Mrs. Henderson in for tea, and the two women talked for an hour about recipes and housekeeping and the challenges of ranch life. When Mrs. Henderson left, she told everyone in town that Penelope Bartlett was a fine woman and Yates Owens was lucky to have her. Coming from Mrs. Henderson, the town's most formidable matriarch, that was an endorsement that mattered. They married in June in a simple ceremony at Linen's small church. The building was full-packed with ranch hands and townspeople who had come to witness the union. Penelope wore her cream-colored dress, her dark hair adorned with wildflowers that Tommy had insisted on gathering. She looked beautiful, but more than that, she looked happy. Truly deeply happy, in a way that transformed her face and made Yates's breath catch in his throat. Yates wore his best suit carefully brushed and pressed. His hand shook slightly as he placed the ring on Penelope's finger, overcome by the weight of the moment. This was really happening. This woman was really agreeing to be his wife, to share his life, to build a future together. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the joy that filled Yates was almost overwhelming. He kissed his bride, and the church erupted in cheers and applause. Miguel was grinning from ear to ear. Tommy was actually crying, not bothering to hide his tears. The other hands were whistling and stomping their feet in celebration. The celebration at the ranch afterward was raucous and heartfelt. Tables had been set up in the yard laden with food that Penelope had prepared in the days leading up to the wedding with help from several women in town. There was roasted beef and chicken, fresh bread and butter, vegetables from the garden that Penelope had revived, pies and cakes that made mouths water. Miguel produced a fiddle that no one knew he owned and began playing surprisingly competent dance music. The hands took turns dancing with the bride, swinging her around the yard with more enthusiasm than skill. Yates danced with his new wife under the stars, surrounded by the people who made up their extended family, and felt that everything he had survived, all the loss and hardship and struggle, had been worth it to bring him to this moment. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and perfect. Two people learning each other with patience and care, taking time to explore and discover, to give and receive pleasure. There was nervousness on both sides, but there was also trust and affection and a growing passion that surprised them both. When Penelope fell asleep in his arms in the big house that was now truly theirs together, Yates lay awake for a long time, grateful beyond measure for the stubborn woman who had arrived in a dusty wagon and proceeded to reorganize his entire life. The days and weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Penelope moved into the main house, bringing her few possessions from the small cabin she had occupied. She made small changes, adding curtains and pictures, rearranging furniture to make the space more welcoming. Yates found he liked coming home to a house that felt lived in, that had a woman's touch in evidence everywhere he looked. They continued to work together on the ranch business, but now there was an ease to their partnership that had not been there before. They could disagree about decisions without it threatening their relationship. They could argue about the best course of action and then accept whatever choice they made together. Their marriage made their business partnership stronger, gave it a foundation of trust and commitment that went beyond profit and loss. The hands adapted quickly to having Penelope as the boss's wife rather than just the cook. If anything, they deferred to her even more understanding now that her authority was absolute. What Penelope said went, and if anyone had a problem with that, they could take it up with Yates, who would inevitably side with his wife. By autumn, Penelope had expanded her influence beyond the ranch. Other ranchers in the area had started coming to her for advice, word having spread about her skill with accounts and organization. She helped several neighbors improve their operations, refusing payment but building relationships that strengthened the entire community. She organized a cooperative among the ranchers' wives and daughters, creating a system where they could sell baked goods and preserves and handcrafts to passing travelers and merchants. The cooperative became surprisingly successful, providing income to families who needed it while creating another revenue stream for the ranch, which provided the meeting space and helped with organization. Penelope had a gift for seeing opportunities that others missed, for finding ways to help people help themselves. "A rising tide lifts all boats," she told Yates one evening when he commented on her generosity. "If our neighbors prosper, we all benefit. Besides, these women deserve the chance to build something of their own, just like I did." Yates pulled her close, marveling, as always, at the generosity of spirit that lived alongside her fierce independence. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too," Penelope replied, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Even when you track mud through my clean kitchen." That was one time, Yates protested. It was 3 times, Penelope corrected, but she was smiling. In the spring of 1880, Penelope announced that she was pregnant. The news filled Yates with joy, mixed with terror. The memory of losing Sarah to fever was still sharp, and the idea of something happening to Penelope was almost unbearable. But Penelope faced pregnancy with the same practical determination she brought to everything else. She consulted with the doctor in Linen, regularly took sensible precautions without becoming an invalid, and continued to manage the ranch's business operations with barely a pause. "I did not fight this hard for independence, just to lose myself in motherhood," she told Yates when he suggested she might want to step back from her duties. "I can be a mother and still be myself." Women have been managing both since the beginning of time. Yates, who had learned early in their marriage that arguing with Penelope when she had that particular tone in her voice was futile, simply kissed her and agreed. And she was right as usual. Penelope balanced pregnancy and ranch management with a grace that seemed effortless, even though Yates knew it was anything but. In her 7th month, Penelope fell ill with a fever that lasted 3 days. Yates barely slept sitting by her bedside, haunted by memories of Sarah's final days. But Penelope was stronger than Sarah had been, perhaps strengthened by her own determination not to be defeated by something as common as fever. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. The doctor examined her and declared both mother and baby healthy. Yates held her hand and wept with relief he could not hide. Yates held her hand and wept with relief he could not hide. The remaining 2 months of her pregnancy were nerve-wracking for Yates, though Penelope took the scare in stride. She was more careful, resting more often than she had before the fever. But she refused to stop working entirely. The ranch still needed her, she insisted, and she would not be treated like an invalid just because she was carrying a child. Their son was born in January of 1881 when Penelope was 25 years old, a robust baby with his father's strong features and his mother's dark eyes. They named him James, after Yates's father, and the boy proved to have lungs that could wake the entire ranch when he was displeased. Penelope managed motherhood the way she managed everything else, with competence and love in equal measure. She insisted on continuing to oversee the ranch's business operations, even with a baby in her arms. She would sit at the desk with James sleeping in a basket beside her, going over accounts and writing correspondence, pausing only to nurse him when he woke. The hands learned to conduct business with the accompaniment of baby sounds, and nobody seemed to mind. If anything, James became a mascot of sorts, passed from hand to hand when Penelope needed both arms free for some task. Miguel became an honorary grandfather, carving toys and telling stories in a mixture of English and Spanish that had James babbling in both languages before he could properly speak either. Tommy proved surprisingly patient with the boy, letting James help with chores in ways that usually created more work, but built bonds that Yates treasured. By the fall of 1882, when James was nearly 2 years old, he had become a curious and active toddler. The ranch settled into yet another new rhythm shaped by the boy's presence. He was everywhere, wanting to be involved in everything, asking endless questions with the persistence only a child could muster. Yates found himself seeing the ranch through his son's eyes, rediscovering the wonder in things he had long taken for granted. Life was good. Better than Yates had ever imagined it could be after Sarah's death. He had a wife he loved and respected, a son who was healthy and thriving, a ranch that was prospering. He should have known that such happiness could not last undisturbed. In the spring of 1883, Penelope announced she was pregnant again. This time there was less fear, though Yates still worried. The memory of the fever during her first pregnancy had not faded. But Penelope was confident, experienced now, and she sailed through the months with barely a complaint. What she did not expect was twins. Caroline and Elizabeth were born in late June, 2 perfect girls who arrived within minutes of each other and immediately proved to have their mother's determined personality. The ranch house suddenly felt full in a way it never had before, filled with the sounds of crying babies and James's excited chatter about his new sisters. Penelope handled the chaos with her usual efficiency, though even she admitted to being overwhelmed at times. She had help now. Several women from town came to assist during those first difficult weeks, and Yates hired a girl from Linen to help with the cooking for the hands so Penelope could focus on the babies. By the time the twins were 6 months old, Penelope was back at her desk organizing the ranch's affairs with one baby in a basket on each side of her chair. The hands got used to conducting business with the accompaniment of twin baby sounds, and if anything, the babies made the ranch feel more like home than ever. James, now 2.5, took his role as big brother seriously. He would sit beside the baskets and tell his sisters long, rambling stories that made no sense to anyone but him. Penelope would watch him with a softness in her eyes that made Yates's chest tighten with love. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under Penelope's management. She had built systems that ran smoothly, relationships with buyers that ensured good prices, and a reputation for honest dealing that brought opportunities others did not get. By 1885, they were one of the most successful ranches in the region. James was 4 now, already showing an interest in the cattle and horses. The twins were 2, and while Caroline showed her mother's head for numbers, even at that young age, Elizabeth had a gift with animals that reminded Yates of himself at that age. In the spring of 1887, their 4th child arrived. Another son whom they named Thomas after Tommy Fredericks, who had become such an integral part of their lives. Tommy himself wept openly when they told him the honor, and from that day forward, he was Uncle Tommy to all the children. Thomas proved to be the easiest baby of them all, content and cheerful, though as he grew, he showed signs of inheriting his mother's organizational genius. Even at 2 years old, he was constantly arranging his toys into neat rows and patterns. By 1890, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. James was 9, already helping with the cattle work. The twins were 7, Caroline spending hours with Penelope going over the books, while Elizabeth spent her time in the barn with the horses. Thomas was 3, toddling around underfoot and rearranging everything he could reach. Yates was 37 now, Penelope 34. They had built something remarkable together, not just a successful ranch, but a real home, a real family. The love between them had only deepened with time, weathered by the challenges of raising children and running a business, but strengthened by their partnership. Then, on a cold November morning in 1891, 13 years after Chester Williams had first appeared at the ranch, he came back. Yates was in the barn with James, showing the boy how to check a horse's hooves when Miguel came running. His face was grim, and Yates felt ice form in his stomach even before Miguel spoke. "He is back," Miguel said. "Chester Williams. He is in town drunk, and he is asking about Penelope. Says he wants what he is owed." Yates felt rage flood through him, hot and immediate. After 13 years after taking the $300 and leaving, the man had returned. He looked at James, who was watching with wide, worried eyes. "Go to the house," Yates told his son. "Stay with your mother and the other children. Do not leave until I come back." James nodded and ran. The boy was old enough to understand when something was wrong, old enough to obey without question. Yates turned to Miguel. "Get the men," he said. "We are going to town." When they rode into Linen, they found Chester Williams holding court in the saloon, already drunk despite the early hour. He had aged badly in 13 years. His face was bloated and red, his hands shook constantly, and he looked like a man who had spent every one of those years drinking himself to death, but somehow had not managed to finish the job. "Well, well," Chester said when Yates walked in. "The great Yates Owens. Come to buy me off again. I paid you what you claimed you were owed," Yates said coldly. "You took it and agreed to leave. What are you doing back here?" $300 doesn't last forever," Chester said. "And I got to thinking, that woman of yours, she is doing real well now, isn't she? Big successful ranch, 4 kids, living high. Meanwhile, what Robert owed me is still unpaid." "Robert's been dead for over 13 years, Yates said. "Whatever debts he had died with him. You know that. The courts told you that." Maybe legally, Chester said the same words he had used 13 years before. "But morally, I am still owed, and I think your rich wife can afford to pay me what I am due. Call it compensation for all those years of suffering. You are not getting another penny," Yates said. "Not from me, not from my wife. Now you have 2 choices. You can leave Kansas voluntarily, or the sheriff can escort you to the county line. Your choice." Chester stood up, swaying slightly. "Or maybe I go talk to Penelope directly. Tell her how things are going to be. Tell those kids of yours about their mama's past, how she was married to a gambling drunk and ran off without paying what was owed. Yates moved before he realized he was going to. He grabbed Chester by the front of his shirt and slammed him against the wall hard enough to rattle the bottles behind the bar. "You will not go near my family," Yates said, his voice deadly quiet. "You will not speak my wife's name. You will not think about my children. Do you understand me?" Chester tried to laugh, but it came out as a wheeze. "You can't protect her forever." "Watch me," Yates said, and threw him toward the door. Miguel and 2 other hands were waiting there. "Get him out of my sight." But when Yates returned to the ranch that afternoon, he found Penelope waiting for him on the porch. She had James with her, and the boy must have told her what had happened. Her face was pale but composed, and when she looked at him, he saw not fear, but determination. "He came back," she said. It was not a question. Yes. What did he want? Money. Threats. The same thing he wanted before, just wrapped up in more bitterness. Penelope was quiet for a moment, looking out over the ranch they had built together. Then she turned to James. "Go check on your sisters and brother," she said gently. "Make sure they are staying out of trouble." When James had gone inside, Penelope looked back at Yates. "We need to end this," she said, "permanently. Not with money this time. Chester will keep coming back as long as he is alive and desperate. We need to make it clear that he has no power over us." "What do you suggest?" Yates asked. "We face him together," Penelope said. "In front of witnesses. We make him admit publicly that he has no legal claim, that he is just a bitter drunk trying to extort money. We get the sheriff involved. We make sure everyone in this county knows exactly what Chester Williams is." Yates thought about it. It was risky. It would bring up Penelope's past in a very public way. But she was right. Paying Chester off again would just delay the inevitable. They needed to end this. "All right," he said. "We will do it your way." The confrontation happened 2 days later in front of the sheriff's office with half the town watching. Chester showed up drunk, as Yates had known he would. Penelope stood beside Yates, straight-backed and dignified, facing down the ghost of her past one final time. "Chester Williams." Penelope said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "You claim my late husband owed you money. Present your proof." Chester fumbled in his pockets, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "This here is a note saying Robert borrowed $200. Penelope took the paper, looked at it, and handed it to the sheriff. "Sheriff Henderson," she said, "you will note this is dated 3 months after my husband's death. It is a forgery, and not even a good one." The sheriff examined the paper and nodded. "She is right. This is fraudulent." Chester's face went red. "You are lying. You know he owed me." "I know nothing of the sort," Penelope said calmly. "When my husband died, his debts were presented to the court in St. Louis. Every legitimate creditor was paid what they were owed from the sale of our property. You were not among them because you had no legitimate claim. You have spent 13 years trying to extort money from me based on a debt that never existed. This ends today." She turned to the sheriff. "I want him arrested for attempted extortion and harassment." The sheriff looked at Chester, then at Penelope, then at the crowd that had gathered. "Chester Williams," he said, "you are under arrest. And I would suggest that when you get out of jail, you leave this county and never come back. Because if I hear you have bothered the Owens family again, I will make sure you regret it." Chester was taken away, still protesting, still claiming he was owed, but his voice had lost its power. Everyone had seen him for what he was, a pathetic drunk clinging to imagined grievances. When it was over, Penelope turned to Yates. "It is finished," she said quietly. "Really finished this time." Yates pulled her close, not caring who was watching. "You were magnificent," he said. She smiled up at him. "We were magnificent. Together." And they were. The years that followed Chester's final defeat were peaceful ones, perhaps the most peaceful Yates and Penelope had ever known. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and life settled into a comfortable rhythm that felt like it could last forever. James grew into a capable young man who loved the ranch work as much as his father did. By 1898, when he was 17, he was handling much of the day-to-day cattle management. Caroline and Elizabeth, now 15, were as different as two people could be. Caroline had her mother's gift for numbers and spent hours helping with the accounts, while Elizabeth worked with the horses and was developing a reputation as one of the finest trainers in the region. Thomas at 11 was already showing signs of becoming even more organized than his mother. He had started raising chickens as a side business, tracking his expenses and income in a ledger with meticulous care. In the spring of 1898, James married Sarah, a practical young woman from a neighboring ranch whom Penelope approved of immediately. They built a small house on the ranch property, and James took on even more responsibility, freeing Yates to focus on other aspects of the operation. Yates was 45 now, and he was starting to feel his age. Nothing serious, just the normal aches and pains of a man who had spent his life doing hard physical work. But in the spring of 1905, when he was 52, everything changed. He woke one morning feeling tired in a way that went beyond normal weariness. It was a bone-deep exhaustion that did not improve with rest. He said nothing to Penelope at first, not wanting to worry her. But she noticed anyway. She always noticed. "You need to see the doctor," she said one evening. "I am fine," Yates protested. "Just getting older." "We are both getting older," Penelope said. She was 49 now, with threads of silver in her dark hair. "But this is different. Please, Yates. For me." He could never refuse her anything when she used that tone. So he rode into Lennon and saw Dr. Morris, who examined him with thorough professionalism before delivering news that Yates had suspected but hoped to avoid. "Your heart is not as strong as it should be," Morris said. "You need to take things easier, reduce stress, accept that you cannot work the way you did when you were younger." Yates told Penelope that evening, and she immediately began reorganizing the ranch operations to reduce his workload. James took over the day-to-day cattle management entirely. Thomas, now 18 and more capable than most men, twice his age, stepped up to handle tasks that required physical effort. Penelope herself made sure Yates stuck to the doctor's orders, managing his schedule with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. "I feel like an invalid." Yates complained one afternoon when Penelope insisted he rest instead of helping repair a fence. "You are not an invalid," Penelope said firmly. "You are a man with a heart condition who needs to be sensible. We have built this ranch to run without depending on any one person. Let it work the way it was designed to work." Yates grumbled but obeyed. And gradually he adjusted to his new limitations. He focused on the horses, which required less physical labor, and spent more time on the business planning that had always been his and Penelope's shared passion. If anything, their partnership deepened during this period. They relied on each other even more fully, and the love between them, tested by time and hardship, proved to be unbreakable. In the spring of 1912, they celebrated their birthdays together. Yates was 59, Penelope 56. There was a large gathering that included not just family, but many of the people whose lives they had touched over the years. Miguel, now 85 and officially retired, though he still puttered around the ranch daily, made a speech that had everyone laughing and crying. "I remember when the boss hired a lady cook," he said. "We all thought she would last maybe a month. Instead, she took over everything, organized us all, and made this ranch what it is today. But more than that, she made it a home. She and Boss Yates together. They showed us what a real partnership looks like. They are the reason we all want to stay here, to be part of what they have built." Penelope was crying openly by the end, and Yates had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "Thank you all," he managed finally. "Thank you for being part of our family, our extended family that goes far beyond blood. Penelope and I could not have built any of this without you." That night, lying in bed, Penelope turned to Yates with a serious expression. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything," Yates replied. "Promise me that if something happens to you, you will not worry about me. I have proven I can survive anything. I have built a life that is not dependent on any one person, even you. So if your heart finally decides it has done enough, you can go in peace knowing I will be all right." Yates felt tears prick his eyes. "I know you will be all right. You are the strongest person I have ever known. But that does not mean I want to leave you. I do not want you to leave me either," Penelope said, her voice breaking. "I want us to have 20 more years together. But if we do not get that, I want you to know that these 33 years have been the best of my life. You gave me everything I needed when I needed it most. You loved me, trusted me, respected me, and built a life with me that exceeded my wildest dreams. Whatever time we have left, I am grateful for every moment." They held each other close that night. Two people who had faced loss and hardship and come out stronger, who had built something lasting together, who loved each other with a depth that only grew with time. Yates's heart held out for 5 more years. 5 good years of grandchildren and horses, of quiet evenings with Penelope and raucous family dinners, of watching the ranch continue to thrive under the combined management of their children. He was able to see Thomas marry his sweetheart, a smart young woman who reminded Yates of Penelope in her youth. He was able to welcome more grandchildren into the family, to watch as everything he and Penelope had built together proved its lasting strength. The night before he died, they had sat together on the porch watching the sunset as they had done so many evenings before. Yates had held her hand and told her one last time how much he loved her, how grateful he was for every day they had shared. She had smiled and kissed him, not knowing it would be the last time. He died peacefully in his sleep that night in October of 1917. He was 64 years old. Penelope was 61, and she woke at dawn to find him gone, his hand still resting in hers, his face peaceful as if he were merely dreaming. The grief was sharp and immediate, cutting through her like a knife. But underneath it was gratitude for 39 years of love, for a partnership that had exceeded anything she had dared to dream, and confidence in the future they had secured together. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, testament to the respect Yates had earned in the community. But it was Penelope's eulogy that everyone remembered, her voice strong despite her tears as she spoke of the man who had given her a chance when she had nothing, who had loved her, not despite her strength, but because of it, who had been her partner in every sense of the word. "He was my heart," she said simply, "and I was his. We built something beautiful together, and it will endure long after we are both gone." In the years that followed, Penelope continued her work with quiet determination. She still rose early, still went over the books with the same meticulous care, still advised the young ranchers' wives who came to her for guidance. But those who knew her well could see the difference. The laughter came less easily now. The light in her eyes was dimmed, waiting. She spoke of Yates, often keeping his memory alive for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled the ranch with new life. She would tell them stories about the man who had given her a chance when she had nothing, who had loved her, not for what she could give him, but for who she was, who had been her partner in every sense of the word. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch, where they had sat together so many times, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold and crimson. And sometimes when the wind was just right and the light hit the land a certain way, she could almost feel him there beside her, his hand in hers, his voice low and warm in her ear. "I am still here," she would whisper to the wind, "but not for much longer. Wait for me." Penelope lived for 13 more years after Yates's death, continuing to manage the business side of the ranch with undiminished competence. She saw her grandchildren grow into adults, welcomed great-grandchildren, and continued to be a pillar of the community. But everyone who knew her understood that part of her was waiting to rejoin the man who had been her partner and her love for 39 years. She died peacefully in the summer of 1930 at the age of 74, surrounded by the family she and Yates had created together. Her last words were simple, "I am coming, Yates," and there was a smile on her face as she went. They buried her beside Yates on the hill overlooking the ranch, and the headstone read simply, "Penelope Bartlett Owens, 1856 to 1930. She came to cook and ended up running everything, including his heart." The ranch continued for generations, after them managed by their descendants who had learned from Penelope's example the value of competence, determination, and the kind of partnership that makes anything possible. The systems she had established, the relationships she had built, the community she had strengthened, all of it endured as testament to what one woman with courage and intelligence could accomplish when given the chance. And on quiet evenings when the sun set over the Kansas prairie, casting golden light across the land that Yates and Penelope had worked together to build into something lasting. Their great-grandchildren would tell stories about the remarkable woman who had arrived in a dusty wagon looking for work and ended up creating a legacy that would span generations. She had come to cook for the ranch hands and ended up running everything, including the heart of the man who had given her a second chance at life and love. Their love story became legend in that part of Kansas, passed down through the years as an example of what real partnership looked like, of how two people who had both suffered loss could find each other and build something beautiful together. It was a story of resilience and determination, of taking chances and trusting love, even when it seemed risky, of building a life together one day at a time with patience and respect and deepening affection. Yates and Penelope's legacy was not just the prosperous ranch they had built, though that was significant. It was not just the family they had raised, though their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward their values and their strength. Their real legacy was the proof that love could flourish even in harsh circumstances, that partnership between equals could create something greater than either person could achieve alone, and that taking a chance on someone who needed one could change not just one life, but generations to come. And that was the story of how a woman came to cook and ended up running everything, including the heart of the man who became her whole world.